My wife's father thinks my wife would be perfect for Jamie, his business partner's son, at their anniversary party, but I asked if the 20-year-old in turn was also perfect for my wife's father. So there I was, minding my own business on a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon, when the mailman delivered what I can only describe as the most passive-aggressive piece of cardstock I've ever had the displeasure of receiving. This wasn't just any ordinary invitation. Oh no, this was Harold's masterpiece. Gold-trimmed edges that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, embossed lettering that screamed, "I have money and I want everyone to know it," and paper so thick you could probably use it as body armor. The thing felt heavier than my college textbooks, which is saying something because those suckers nearly gave me a hernia. Harold, my dear father-in-law, had outdone himself this time. 35 years of wedded bliss, apparently, and he wanted the whole world to celebrate with him and Gloria. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all for celebrating love and marriage and all that Hallmark card nonsense. But when it comes from Harold, there's always a catch. There's always some hidden agenda lurking beneath that fake smile and those golf course tan cheeks of his. See, Harold loves exactly two things in this world: his ridiculously oversized ego and his business partner's son, Jamie. And when I say loves, I mean the kind of obsessive admiration usually reserved for cult leaders or boy band members. This guy Jamie is apparently everything I'm not: tall, rich, and according to Harold's never-ending commentary, the perfect man for my wife, Claire. Yeah, you heard that right. My wife. The woman I've been married to for 5 whole years, through thick and thin, through her experimental cooking phase and my brief obsession with fantasy football. But apparently, in Harold's twisted little universe, I'm just the trial version husband, like some kind of software beta test that's gone on way too long. The invitation itself was a work of art in psychological warfare. Join us for an evening of celebration, fine dining, and family togetherness. It read in that fancy script font that rich people love so much. Family togetherness. That's rich, coming from a guy who once asked me at Christmas dinner why I wasn't more like his accountant's nephew. I swear, if Harold could have added a footnote that said, "Bring your resume and a list of your inadequacies," he would have done it in a heartbeat. I found Claire in the kitchen, doing that thing she does where she pretends to be busy organizing spices alphabetically when she's actually avoiding something. She took one look at the invitation in my hand, and her face went through about 17 different expressions before settling on that familiar look of resigned dread. You know the one. It's the same face people make when they realize they've forgotten to file their taxes until April 14th. "So," I said, waving the golden ticket to hell in the air, "looks like Daddy Dearest wants to throw himself another party. Think they'll seat me at the kids' table next to the clowns and balloon animals? At least then I'd have some intelligent conversation for once." Claire actually laughed at that one, which was encouraging. She's got this amazing laugh that makes everything seem less catastrophic, even when we're talking about spending an evening with her father. But then she gave me that look, the one that wives perfect sometime around year 2 of marriage. It's part warning, part plea, and part threat all rolled into one perfectly executed facial expression. "Promise me you won't start anything," she said, using her serious voice. "I know how he gets, and I know how you get when he gets how he gets. Just try to be the bigger person, okay? The bigger person. That's what she always says. Be the bigger person. Turn the other cheek. Take the high road." All those nice little phrases that sound great in theory, but fall apart the moment Harold opens his mouth and starts comparing me to literally every other man on the planet. But I nodded anyway because I love her, and because I'm an idiot who thinks maybe this time will be different. Spoiler alert, I was absolutely going to start everything. The thing about Harold is that he doesn't just dislike me. That would be too simple, too straightforward. No, Harold has elevated his disapproval of me into an art form. He's like a master chef, but instead of creating delicious meals, he crafts these perfectly seasoned insults that leave you wondering whether you've just been complimented or completely destroyed. It's impressive in a twisted, soul-crushing kind of way. Take last Thanksgiving, for example. The man spent 20 minutes explaining to the entire dinner table why Jamie would have been the perfect person to carve the turkey because he has such steady hands from all that tennis he plays at the country club. Meanwhile, I'm sitting right there, actual husband to his actual daughter, holding an actual carving knife like some kind of caveman, who doesn't understand the sophisticated art of poultry dismemberment. But this invitation felt different. This wasn't just another casual family gathering where Harold could take potshots at my career choices and my questionable taste in sneakers. This was a celebration, a big fancy to-do with all the extended family and Harold's business cronies. This was his stage, his moment to shine, and something told me that Jamie was going to be the guest of honor, right alongside the happy anniversary couple, of course. I could already picture it. Harold raising his champagne glass, giving some heartfelt speech about love and commitment, and then somehow managing to work in a comment about how Jamie represents everything a young man should aspire to be. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting there, probably at a table near the bathroom, wondering how I'd manage to marry into a family that treats marriage proposals like corporate mergers. Claire was still looking at me with those hopeful eyes, probably praying to whatever deity watches over wives of sarcastic husbands that I'd somehow develop a sense of diplomacy in the next few days. Fat chance. If Harold wanted to play his little games, then game on. I've been practicing my smiles in the mirror, perfecting that special blend of polite interest and barely contained homicidal rage that's perfect for family functions. The invitation sat on our kitchen counter for the rest of the evening, gleaming under the fluorescent lights like some kind of cursed artifact. Every time I walked past it, I could practically hear Harold's voice echoing through the cardstock. Why aren't you more successful? Why aren't you taller? Why aren't you Jamie? Well, Harold, buckle up. Because this time, your trial version son-in-law is about to give you the performance of a lifetime. Let me paint you a picture of what it's like meeting Harold for the first time. Imagine walking into a job interview, except the interviewer is wearing khakis and a polo shirt, has the personality of a drill sergeant, and somehow has the legal authority to make your life miserable for the foreseeable future. That's Harold in a nutshell, part country club president, part military commander, and 100% pain in my ass. The first time Claire brought me home to meet her parents, I thought I was prepared. I'd done my research, you know? I knew Harold owned some kind of manufacturing business that made parts for things I'd never heard of. I knew he played golf every Wednesday and Sunday. I knew he drove a BMW that he washed more often than most people shower. What I didn't know was that meeting Harold wasn't just a casual "hey, nice to meet you" situation. It was more like reporting for duty at Fort Dickhead. The interrogation, because let's call it what it was, started before I'd even made it through the front door. "So you're the young man dating my Claire," he said, looking me up and down like I was a used car he was considering purchasing. Not, "nice to meet you," or "welcome to our home." Just this clinical assessment that made me feel like I should have brought my tax returns and a letter of recommendation from my mother. Then came the questions. Sweet Jesus, the questions. "What's your 5-year plan?" he barked, settling into his leather recliner like he was conducting a board meeting. I remember thinking, 5-year plan? Dude, I'm 23 and trying to figure out if I can afford name brand cereal this week. But I gave him some bullshit answer about career advancement and financial stability while secretly wondering if anyone actually has a real 5-year plan or if we're all just winging it and hoping for the best. "How much do you make after taxes?" That was question number 2, delivered with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. I nearly choked on the fancy water Gloria had given me in what was probably a crystal glass worth more than my security deposit. Who asked that? Who actually says those words out loud to another human being? But Harold just sat there, waiting for an answer like this was perfectly normal dinner conversation. And then, God help me, came the kicker. "Why aren't you taller?" I kid you not. Those exact words came out of this man's mouth. Like height was some kind of personal failing on my part. Like I'd actively chosen to be 5'10" instead of whatever towering giant he thought his daughter deserved. I looked over at Claire, hoping she'd jump in with a "dad, what the hell?" But she just smiled this tight, practiced smile that I'd later learn was her survival mechanism for dealing with Harold's particular brand of crazy. Meanwhile, Gloria sat there like some kind of deranged pageant queen, nodding along to everything Harold said while maintaining this plastic smile that never quite reached her eyes. "More iced tea, dear?" she'd chirp between Harold's verbal assaults, as if offering beverages could somehow offset the psychological warfare happening in her living room. The woman had perfected the art of pretending everything was absolutely peachy, while her husband systematically dismantled the self-esteem of anyone who dared to date their daughter. As I got to know the family better over the years, I started to understand the twisted ecosystem Claire had grown up in. This wasn't just Harold being protective. This was Harold running a full-scale operation designed to ensure that no man would ever be good enough for his precious daughter. The poor girl had spent her entire childhood and adolescence competing for approval in a game where the rules changed daily and victory was essentially impossible. Claire told me stories that made my heart break and my fists clench simultaneously. Like the time in high school when she made honor roll, and instead of congratulating her, Harold asked why she wasn't class valedictorian like Tommy Morrison, whose dad worked in Harold's accounting department. Or when she learned to play piano and actually got pretty damn good at it, only to have Harold compare her to every other kid who played piano at their church. Sarah Jenkins plays with such passion, he'd say, completely oblivious to the fact that his own daughter was sitting right there, fingers still sore from practicing for hours just to get a good job that never came. The football team comparisons were particularly brutal. Claire wasn't exactly built for contact sports, being about as athletically inclined as a librarian with chronic back pain. But that didn't stop Harold from wondering aloud why she couldn't be more like the boys on the varsity squad. "Look at Jake Peterson," he'd say during dinner, as if Jake Peterson was some kind of gold standard for human achievement. Star quarterback, straight A's, full scholarship to state. Now that's what I call well-rounded. Never mind that Claire was getting straight A's too. Apparently academic success only counted if you could also throw a perfect spiral pass. And don't even get me started on the church piano situation. Every Sunday after service, Harold would find some way to mention how beautifully little Susie whatever played during the offering, or how Billy somebody's rendition of Amazing Grace really moved the congregation. Meanwhile, Claire had been playing piano since she was 7, but God forbid Harold actually acknowledge his own daughter's talents when there were other people's kids to praise instead. I walked into this family thinking that love conquered all, that as long as Claire and I were happy together, everything else would work itself out. What a naive little lamb I was, skipping merrily into the wolf's den with nothing but good intentions and a genuine belief that people were basically reasonable when you got down to it. I should have known better. I should have recognized the warning signs during that first dinner when Harold spent 45 minutes explaining why Jamie, who I hadn't even met yet, was such an outstanding young man with such a bright future ahead of him. But no, I was young and optimistic and stupidly in love. I figured Harold was just being a protective father, maybe a little old-fashioned in his approach, but ultimately harmless. I thought if I just proved myself worthy, if I showed him I was serious about Claire and had my shit together, he'd eventually come around. I might as well have expected him to sprout wings and start granting wishes, because that would have been about as likely as Harold ever giving me his approval. Looking back now, 5 years deep in this marriage, I realize I should have asked for hazard pay from day one. You know that moment in movies when the antagonist makes their grand entrance and everything goes into slow motion? The music swells, the lighting gets all dramatic, and everyone turns to stare like they're witnessing the second coming of Christ himself? That's exactly what happened when Jamie walked into Harold's anniversary party. Except instead of ominous villain music, I swear I heard Chariots of Fire playing in Harold's head. The party was already in full swing by the time Golden Boy decided to grace us with his presence. Claire and I had been making small talk with her Aunt Martha about her cat's recent surgery, riveting stuff. Really, when the room's energy shifted. It was like someone had flipped a switch, and suddenly every head turned toward the entrance. And there he was, Jamie Morrison, Harold's wet dream in human form, strutting through the door like he owned the place. First thing you notice about Jamie? The suit. This wasn't some off-the-rack number from Men's Warehouse that guys like me wear to weddings and funerals. Oh no, this was clearly custom-tailored, probably cost more than my car, and fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body by a team of Italian master craftsmen. The color was this perfect shade of charcoal gray that somehow made his eyes look bluer and his shoulders look broader. I looked down at my own suit, which I'd bought on sale at Target and had dry cleaned exactly once, and suddenly felt like I was wearing a garbage bag held together with safety pins. Then there were the teeth. Sweet mother of pearl, those teeth. Jamie smiled as he worked the room, and I swear his incisors actually sparkled like something out of a toothpaste commercial. These weren't normal human teeth. These were the kind of teeth that dentists probably used as inspiration for other people's veneers. I found myself unconsciously running my tongue over my own slightly crooked bottom teeth and wondering if it was too late in life to get braces. But the real kicker was the hair. This guy had hair that looked like he'd just stepped out of a magazine shoot for Successful Young Executives Weekly. Not a strand out of place, perfectly styled without looking like he'd used half a bottle of gel to achieve it. Meanwhile, I'd been battling a cowlick all evening that made me look like I'd stuck my finger in an electrical socket. I caught my reflection in one of Gloria's many decorative mirrors and seriously considered making a break for the bathroom to attempt some emergency grooming. Harold lit up like the 4th of July when he spotted Jamie. I'm talking full-on Christmas morning excitement, the kind of joy usually reserved for lottery winners and new parents. His whole face transformed from its usual state of mild disapproval to something resembling actual human happiness. It was honestly disturbing to witness, like watching a robot suddenly develop emotions. "Jamie," Harold boomed across the room, his voice carrying over the jazz quartet that was playing in the corner. "There's the man of the hour." Man of the hour? At Harold's anniversary party? I looked around, wondering if I'd missed some kind of memo about this being a dual celebration. But no, apparently Jamie's mere presence was enough to warrant main character status at someone else's party. The reunion was nauseating to watch. Harold practically bounced over to Jamie like an overgrown golden retriever greeting its favorite human. They did that weird handshake-hug combo that successful men do when they want to show affection but maintain their masculine dignity. Harold's business partner, Jamie's dad, appeared out of nowhere like he'd been waiting in the wings for his cue. And suddenly, it was a full-blown bromance convention right there in the middle of the party. "Claire," Harold called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of fake casualness that every married person learns to recognize as trouble. "Come over here and say hello to Jamie. Don't you think he looks fantastic?" The question was clearly rhetorical because Harold was already answering it himself with his approving nods and proud smile, like he'd personally been responsible for Jamie's general existence. I leaned over to Claire and whispered, "Wow, can't believe I lost you to Captain Banana Republic over there." She elbowed me in the ribs, but I caught her trying not to smile. At least she still had a sense of humor about her father's obvious man crush. Jamie worked his way over to us, and I have to admit, the guy had presence. He moved through the crowd like he belonged there. Like every room he entered automatically became a better place just because he'd graced it with his existence. People gravitated toward him. Conversations paused as he passed, and I swear I saw at least 3 middle-aged women check their lipstick in the reflection of their wine glasses. When he finally reached us, Jamie extended his hand toward me with a grip that felt like a performance. You know the type, firm enough to show he worked out regularly, held just long enough to establish dominance, accompanied by the kind of direct eye contact that said, "I play golf with Daddy's money, and I'm not ashamed of it." His palm was soft, probably thanks to weekly manicures and a lifetime of avoiding actual manual labor. "You must be Claire's husband," he said, and I swear there was just the tiniest emphasis on the word husband, like he was surprised anyone had actually married her before he'd gotten around to it. His smile was perfect, not too big, not too small, just the right amount of teeth showing to seem friendly without appearing desperate. This guy had definitely practiced this exact expression in mirrors. "That's me," I replied, matching his grip and holding it just a beat longer than socially necessary. "The husband. You know, the guy who actually married her." I smiled back, thinking, "Congratulations, buddy, you just became tonight's free entertainment." Because if Harold wanted to play this game, if he wanted to parade his golden boy around like some kind of prize bowl at a county fair, then I was going to make sure everyone got their money's worth. Jamie's smile flickered for just a nanosecond, so brief you might have missed it if you weren't looking for it. But I was looking for it, and I saw that moment of uncertainty, that tiny crack in his perfect facade. Good. Let him wonder what I was thinking. Let him try to figure out whether I was going to play nice or blow this whole thing up. The night was young, and the real show was just getting started. Dinner at Harold's house is like participating in a social experiment designed by sadists. You've got your fancy table settings that cost more than most people's monthly rent, your crystal glasses that you're terrified to actually drink from because one wrong move and you're bankrupt, and your carefully arranged seating chart that's clearly been planned with military precision. Tonight was no exception, except Harold had outdone himself by somehow managing to seat Jamie directly across from Claire and me. like we were contestants on some twisted game show called Who Deserves My Daughter More? The dining room was packed with Harold's greatest hits collection of family members and business associates. There was Uncle Bill, who always smelled like cigars and made inappropriate comments about the waitstaff. Cousin Linda was there with her husband, whose name I could never remember, probably because his entire personality could be summed up as agrees with whatever Linda says. Harold's business buddies filled out the rest of the table, a collection of middle-aged men in expensive suits who all looked like they'd been manufactured in the same factory that produces golf club members and yacht owners. The conversation started innocently enough. People were discussing the usual safe topics: the weather, the local sports teams, Gloria's new landscaping project that had apparently cost enough to fund a small nation's defense budget. I was actually starting to relax, thinking maybe Harold would behave himself for once. Maybe this evening wouldn't turn into the psychological warfare I'd been expecting. I should have known better. The shift happened somewhere between the salad course and the main dish. Harold had been holding court at the head of the table, regaling everyone with stories about the good old days of his business, when he suddenly pivoted to his favorite subject: other people's children and how they compared to everyone else's. It's like the man had a PhD in comparative offspring analysis. "You know," Harold said, cutting into his perfectly prepared beef tenderloin with surgical precision, "Jamie here just got promoted to regional manager at his father's company." Regional manager? At 28 years old. Can you believe that? He looked around the table like he'd just announced that Jamie had discovered the cure for cancer while simultaneously ending world hunger. Jamie, to his credit, had the decency to look slightly embarrassed by Harold's gushing praise. "It's really not that big a deal," he said with false modesty that fooled absolutely no one. "I've been working my way up like everyone else." Right? Working your way up in Daddy's company is exactly like everyone else's experience. I'm sure his climb to the top had nothing to do with sharing DNA with the owner. But Harold wasn't finished. "Oh no, this was just the opening act. And he's single." Harold announced this like it was breaking news, like CNN should interrupt their regular programming to inform the world that Jamie Morrison remained romantically unattached. Single, successful, and looking for the right woman to settle down with. Isn't that wonderful? The table murmured appropriate responses, but I could feel the tension building like air pressure before a thunderstorm. Claire's grip on her fork tightened, and I noticed she'd stopped eating entirely. She knew what was coming. Hell, we all knew what was coming. Harold had about as much subtlety as a neon sign. "You know, Claire," Harold continued, his voice taking on that particular tone of fake casualness that every family member learns to fear. "Don't you think Jamie would have been perfect for you?" He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, including the poor waiter who was refilling water glasses and probably wished he'd called in sick tonight. The man didn't even try to pretend this was a private conversation. He delivered the line like he was addressing the United Nations General Assembly. The table went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people enjoying their meal, but that special kind of awkward silence that makes you acutely aware of every sound. The clink of silverware against plates, the soft jazz music playing in the background, the sound of my own blood pressure skyrocketing. Uncle Bill stopped chewing mid-bite. Cousin Linda's husband actually looked up from his plate for the first time all evening. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, a piece of perfectly seasoned asparagus dangling from the tines like it was as shocked as I was. I looked at Harold, then at Jamie, then back at Harold, waiting for someone to laugh and say it was all just a hilarious misunderstanding. But Harold just sat there with this expectant smile, like he'd asked a perfectly reasonable question and was genuinely curious about Claire's response. That's when something inside me snapped. Not in an explosive, table-flipping way. More like the sound a rubber band makes when it finally gives up after being stretched too far. I set down my fork, took a sip of wine to buy myself a second to formulate the perfect response, and looked Harold straight in the eye. "Yeah, Claire's also hardworking, ambitious, and..." I paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. "Married. To me. Remember?" I smiled as I said it. The kind of smile you might give someone who just asked if the sky was blue or whether water was wet. The reaction was immediate and beautiful. Some relatives chuckled nervously, like they were watching a nature documentary where a gazelle suddenly turned around and started chasing the lion. Others looked down at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their dinner rolls. My cousin-in-law Lisa, God bless her, muttered, awkward, under her breath, but loud enough for half the table to hear. Harold's face went through several interesting color changes, settling somewhere between embarrassed pink and indignant red. Jamie looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear, probably regretting whatever business relationship had dragged him into this family drama. Meanwhile, Gloria just kept smiling that pageant queen smile, like someone had wound her up and she was stuck in pleasantry mode. I felt Claire's hand find my knee under the table, her fingers squeezing in what I interpreted as either "thank you for standing up for me" or "please don't completely destroy my family before dessert is served." Maybe both. Probably both. But Harold wasn't done yet. Oh no, the man was just getting warmed up, and I had a feeling that my little comeback had just declared war on the most passive-aggressive battlefield known to mankind, the family dinner table. You know that moment when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and your brain is screaming, "Don't jump. Don't jump. This is a terrible idea." But there's this tiny voice in the back of your head whispering, "But wouldn't it be amazing if you could fly?" That's exactly where I found myself sitting at Harold's perfectly set dining room table. Common sense was telling me to smile politely, finish my overpriced beef, and pretend this whole evening never happened. But that little devil on my shoulder? He was doing backflips and chanting, "Burn it all down." Harold wanted a show? Fine. I'd give him a show that would make Broadway jealous. The table was still recovering from my last comment about Claire being married to me. What a revolutionary concept, when I decided that subtle wasn't working. Harold had spent 5 years taking potshots at me, 5 years comparing me to every other man who'd ever drawn breath, 5 years making me feel like I was auditioning for a role I'd already been cast in. Well, audition time was over, and it was time for the main performance. I reached for my wine glass, noting with satisfaction that my hand was perfectly steady. Amazing how calm you can feel when you've finally decided to stop giving a damn about consequences. The wine was some expensive vintage that Harold had probably spent 20 minutes explaining to everyone before dinner, the kind of wine that comes with its own biography and costs more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a week. "You know what?" I said, my voice carrying just enough volume to cut through the nervous chatter that had erupted after my last comment. "I think we should have a toast." I stood up, because nothing says, "I'm about to ruin everyone's evening," quite like a dramatic toast at a family dinner. The conversations died instantly. Even the jazz quartet in the corner seemed to quiet down, like they sensed the impending carnage and wanted front row seats. All eyes were on me, and I have to admit, it felt pretty damn good. For 5 years, I'd been the supporting character in Harold's little drama. Tonight, I was taking center stage. "To Jamie," I began, raising my glass toward Golden Boy himself, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with each passing second. The man who apparently should have been sitting in my chair tonight. The guy who's everything a father-in-law could want in a son-in-law. If only he'd had the good sense to marry said father-in-law's daughter before some other guy came along and ruined everything. The table erupted in awkward laughter, the kind of nervous tittering you hear when people aren't sure if they're witnessing comedy or a mental breakdown. Uncle Bill actually snorted into his wine, which would have been funny under different circumstances. Cousin Linda's husband looked like he was taking notes, probably filing this away for future family gatherings when he needed entertainment. Jamie's perfect smile had frozen on his face like he'd been hit with a paralysis ray. His eyes darted between me and Harold, probably calculating the fastest route to the nearest exit. The poor guy had walked into this anniversary party expecting to schmooze with some business contacts and maybe charm a few middle-aged ladies with stories about his tennis game. Instead, he'd become the unwilling star of my one-man roast of Harold's matchmaking delusions. "Cheers," I finished, taking a long, deliberate sip while maintaining eye contact with Harold. The wine actually tasted better now that I was using it as a prop in my psychological warfare campaign. But I wasn't done. Oh no, this was just the warm-up act. Harold was sitting there with his mouth slightly agape, probably trying to process what had just happened. He looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to him using interpretive dance. This was the man who'd spent years perfecting the art of subtle insults. And here I was, serving them back to him with all the subtlety of a demolition crew. Claire was staring at me with a mixture of horror and admiration that I'd never seen before. It was like watching someone discover that their mild-mannered husband was actually a superhero, Except instead of fighting crime, I was fighting passive-aggressive in-laws with sarcasm and public humiliation. I sat back down and leaned toward Harold, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow managed to carry to every corner of the dining room. "Out of curiosity, Harold," I said, cutting into my beef like we were having the most casual conversation in the world, "since you're so good at playing Cupid, and I mean, really, you should consider a career change because you've got a real talent for this. Who's perfect for you?" Harold's eyebrows shot up so fast they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "What do you mean?" he asked, but his voice had that quality people get when they know they're walking into a trap but can't figure out how to avoid it. "Well, I mean, if Claire's perfect for Jamie here," I gestured toward our uncomfortable guest star, "then surely there's someone out there who's perfect for you. I'm just wondering who that might be." I paused, pretending to think deeply about this philosophical question. "That 20-year-old intern I saw you winking at near the bar earlier, maybe? The one with the blonde hair and the short dress who was hanging on your every word during your speech about quarterly projections." The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that I swear I could hear the ice melting in people's drinks. Harold's face had gone from pink to red to a shade of purple that probably had its own name in the Crayola crayon box. Gloria's wine glass was trembling in her hand, like she was experiencing a small earthquake. Jamie looked like he wanted to disappear into his perfectly tailored suit. The poor guy had probably never experienced anything like this at his country club dinner parties, where the biggest scandal was someone using the wrong fork for their salad course. But I still wasn't finished. The devil on my shoulder was doing a victory dance, and I was just getting started. Or is that just mentorship these days? I added, using air quotes that could probably be seen from space. There's a moment in every epic disaster movie when everything goes quiet right before the explosion. The camera pans across all the terrified faces, the background music stops, and you can practically hear the collective intake of breath from everyone who's about to witness absolute carnage. That's exactly what happened in Harold's dining room the second those words left my mouth. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that presses down on your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of every tiny sound. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away like a countdown timer. I could hear the soft hiss of Gloria's breathing as she tried not to hyperventilate into her wine glass. I could even hear the jazz quartet in the corner, who had apparently decided that this was the perfect moment to take an extended break, probably sensing that they were about to witness either a murder or a complete family meltdown. The first casualty of my verbal bomb was Cousin Linda's husband, who had been in the middle of taking a bite of his dinner roll when I dropped the intern comment. The poor guy's hand just stopped mid-motion, like someone had pressed pause on his entire existence. His mouth hung open, revealing a half-chewed piece of bread that he seemed to have forgotten how to swallow. It would have been comical if the rest of the table wasn't frozen in similar states of shock. Then came the forks. Oh, the beautiful symphony of dropped silverware that followed my comment was like music to my ears. Uncle Bill's fork hit his plate with a sharp clink that echoed through the room like a gunshot. Cousin Linda actually let go of her knife entirely, and it clattered onto her bread plate with enough force to chip the delicate porcelain. Even the waiter, who had been discreetly refilling water glasses in the background, fumbled his pitcher and had to catch it before it crashed to the floor. But the real show was happening on people's faces. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, except instead of twisted metal and broken glass, you had twisted expressions and shattered social expectations. Harold's face had cycled through so many colors that I was starting to worry he might actually stroke out right there at his own anniversary party. His eyes were bulging like a cartoon character who'd just seen a ghost, and his mouth was working soundlessly, like a fish that had been yanked out of water. Gloria's reaction was perhaps the most disturbing of all. That pageant queen smile of hers had finally cracked, and underneath it was this look of pure panic that made me almost feel bad about what I'd just done. Her wine glass was trembling in her manicured hands like she was having her own personal earthquake, and I could see her mentally calculating how much damage control she was going to have to do after tonight. Jamie looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His perfect composure had completely evaporated, and he was staring at me with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching someone juggle chainsaws blindfolded. The poor guy had probably never encountered anything like this in his sheltered, country club existence. This wasn't the kind of dinner conversation they taught you how to handle in business school. My cousin-in-law Lisa was the first to break. She let out this strangled noise that was half gasp, half laugh, like she couldn't decide whether she was witnessing comedy or tragedy. Her hand flew to her mouth like she was trying to stuff the sound back in, but it was too late. The damage was done, and her reaction seemed to give everyone else permission to remember how to breathe. The gasps that followed were like a chorus of scandalized opera singers hitting their high notes. Aunt Martha actually clutched her pearls, literally clutched them, like she was in some kind of Victorian melodrama. Uncle Bill made this weird, choking sound and reached for his water glass with shaking hands. Even the business associates, who I'd assumed were immune to family drama by virtue of being outsiders, looked like they'd just witnessed a public execution. Claire whispered, "Oh my God, please stop," right next to me, but her voice was so quiet I was probably the only one who heard it. Her face had gone pale, but I caught something else in her expression, a tiny spark of satisfaction that she was trying desperately to hide. Part of her was horrified by what I was doing, but another part was enjoying watching her father get a taste of his own medicine after years of dishing it out. But I couldn't stop. The devil on my shoulder was doing victory laps, and the look on Harold's face was just too delicious to walk away from. I leaned back in my chair casually, like I'd just made a comment about the weather instead of dropping a nuclear bomb in the middle of his anniversary dinner. "I mean, Harold," I continued, my voice perfectly conversational, "if Claire's perfect for Jamie, then maybe you and the intern could be the next office power couple. Just think of the company benefits." I took another sip of wine, savoring both the vintage and the absolute chaos I'd unleashed. Harold's mouth was still opening and closing silently, like he was trying to form words, but his brain had temporarily forgotten how language worked. His face had settled into a shade of red that probably violated several laws of physics. I was genuinely starting to wonder if I should call 911, because the man looked like he was about to either explode or implode, and I wasn't sure which would be messier. The business associates were exchanging glances that clearly said, "How do we get out of here without making this worse?" One of them had actually started to push his chair back from the table, probably calculating the fastest route to his car. Another was studying his wine glass like it contained the secrets of the universe, clearly hoping that if he avoided eye contact long enough, he might become invisible. Jamie had given up all pretense of maintaining his composure and was now openly staring at me like I was some kind of fascinating scientific specimen that had just escaped from a laboratory. His perfect hair was still perfect, but everything else about him screamed, "Get me the hell out of here before this crazy person says something even worse." The room felt like a powder keg, and I'd just lit the fuse. You know how in action movies, right before the big explosion, there's always that split second where everything goes completely still? The hero dives away in slow motion, debris starts floating through the air like confetti, and you can practically see the shockwave building? That's exactly what Harold's dining room felt like in the moments before he finally detonated. The man had been building pressure like a steam engine with a busted safety valve, and I could literally see the moment when his brain finally processed what I'd just said about him and his intern. His face went through one final color change, from that angry purple to an almost translucent white, like all the blood had suddenly drained out of his head and pooled somewhere around his ankles. Then Harold's fist came down on that pristine dining room table like the hammer of God himself. Wham! The sound was incredible. It wasn't just loud. It was the kind of bone-rattling impact that you feel in your chest cavity. Every piece of expensive china jumped like it had been electrocuted. Wine glasses performed little pirouettes, sending drops of burgundy flying across Gloria's perfect white tablecloth like abstract art. The salt and pepper shakers, which were probably worth more than my monthly salary, actually left the table entirely, bouncing once before rolling across the hardwood floor with these pathetic little tinkling sounds. "That's inappropriate," Harold thundered, his voice reaching decibel levels that probably violated several noise ordinances. The man's vocal cords had apparently found their reserve power supply, because this wasn't just shouting. This was the kind of roar that makes small children hide behind their mothers and grown men question their life choices. But here's the beautiful thing about finally reaching the point where you don't give a damn anymore. Harold's explosion just made me feel calmer. It was like watching a toddler have a meltdown in the grocery store, loud, dramatic, and ultimately just confirming what you already suspected about their emotional maturity. I shrugged. Just a simple, casual shrug, like Harold had asked me whether I preferred paper or plastic bags at the checkout counter. So is suggesting my wife would be perfect for another man. At your wedding anniversary, no less. I paused to take another sip of wine, which somehow tasted even better now that Harold was having his public breakdown. But hey, we're all about inappropriateness tonight, right? The room went absolutely nuclear. If the previous silence had been uncomfortable, this was something else entirely. This was the kind of chaos that makes you understand why some animals just play dead when they're threatened. Uncle Bill actually pushed his chair back from the table and stood up, like he was ready to either referee a fight or make a run for the exit. Cousin Linda had her phone out. Whether she was planning to call 911 or just record the whole thing for posterity, I couldn't tell. But the reactions around the table were split right down the middle, and that's when I realized I'd accidentally started a revolution. Half the family looked absolutely scandalized, clutching their pearls and fanning themselves like Victorian ladies who'd just witnessed someone's ankle. The other half, and God bless them for this, were trying desperately not to laugh. My uncle-in-law whispered to his wife, loud enough for half the table to hear. Finally, someone said it. His wife elbowed him in the ribs, but she was fighting back a smile too. Even Aunt Martha, despite her earlier pearl clutching, had this gleam in her eye that suggested she was enjoying the show more than she wanted to admit. The business associates had given up all pretense of being polite dinner guests. They were exchanging glances that clearly said, "Is this really happening? And should we leave? And this is better than anything on Netflix." One of them had actually pulled out his phone and was either texting his wife or possibly live tweeting the whole disaster. Harold was still standing, his hands planted on the table like he was holding it down to keep it from floating away. His face had returned to that dangerous shade of purple, and I could see a vein in his forehead that was pulsing in rhythm with what I assumed was his rapidly elevated heart rate. The man looked like he was about to either have a coronary or flip the entire table over like some kind of middle-aged Incredible Hulk. "You," he started, pointing a shaking finger at me, but apparently rage had temporarily short-circuited his ability to form complete sentences. He tried again. "You can't." "Nope," still broken. It was like watching someone try to start a car with a dead battery. Jamie, meanwhile, had achieved a level of uncomfortable that I didn't think was humanly possible. The poor guy was pressed back in his chair like he was trying to merge with the upholstery and become invisible. His perfect hair was still perfect, but everything else about him screamed, "I should have stayed home tonight." He kept looking between Harold and me like he was watching a tennis match, except instead of a ball going back and forth, it was insults and family drama. But I wasn't done with Jamie yet. Oh no, Golden Boy had been the catalyst for this whole evening, and it seemed only fair to include him in the finale. I looked him dead in the eye, noting with satisfaction that his perfect composure had completely evaporated, and delivered what I hoped would be the killing blow. "Don't worry, Jamie," I said, my voice carrying just the right amount of false sympathy. "She's not available." I gestured toward Claire, who was sitting next to me looking like she couldn't decide whether to strangle me or give me a standing ovation. "But I hear Harold is." The explosion that followed made Harold's first outburst look like a gentle sneeze. Gloria actually shrieked, not a scream, but a full-on horror movie shriek that probably shattered windows 3 houses down. Several people jumped up from their chairs, though whether they were planning to intervene or just get a better view of the carnage, I couldn't tell. The jazz quartet in the corner had apparently decided this was their cue to pack up and leave, because I could hear them frantically putting away their instruments like the building was on fire. Harold's second fist slam made the first one look amateur. This time, an actual wine glass didn't survive the impact, sending burgundy splashing across Gloria's perfect centerpiece like a Jackson Pollock painting. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when someone's brain completely short-circuits from conflicting emotions, you should have seen Claire's face in that moment. She was sitting there next to me, watching her father have what could generously be called a complete psychological breakdown, while her husband, that would be me, had just delivered the verbal equivalent of a nuclear warhead to her family's dinner table. The poor woman looked like she was trying to solve advanced calculus while riding a roller coaster during an earthquake. Her eyes were darting between me and Harold like she was watching the world's most uncomfortable tennis match, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to process what had just happened. On one hand, I just publicly humiliated her father at his own anniversary party in front of family, friends, and business associates. On the other hand, her father had spent the entire evening trying to auction her off to another man like she was livestock at a county fair. It was beautiful and terrible to watch. "You're making things worse," she hissed at me through gritted teeth. But her voice had this quality to it that suggested she wasn't entirely sure she believed what she was saying. It was like watching someone scold a dog for barking at a burglar. Technically inappropriate behavior, but also kind of exactly what the situation called for. Her face was flushed, and not just from embarrassment. There was something else there, something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction trying to hide behind a mask of social propriety. Claire had spent her entire life being the good daughter, the one who smiled politely, while Harold compared her to every other human being on the planet. She'd perfected the art of gracious acceptance of her father's casual cruelty, turning the other cheek so often she probably had permanent neck damage. But tonight, someone had finally fought back. Someone had finally called Harold on his bullshit, and that someone happened to be the man she'd married. The man who was supposed to love and protect her, who was supposed to be in her corner when the rest of the world felt like it was against her. I leaned closer to her, keeping my voice low enough that the rest of the chaos-filled dining room couldn't hear. "Worse than your dad auctioning you off like a used car at his anniversary party?" I asked, and I saw her bite her lip to keep from responding immediately. Because what could she say to that? That Harold's behavior was perfectly acceptable? That suggesting your married daughter would be perfect for another man was just good old-fashioned family fun? The thing about Claire is that she's got this incredible laugh, not the polite, social laugh she uses at family gatherings, but this real, genuine laugh that comes from somewhere deep in her chest and makes her whole face light up. And in that moment, despite everything that was happening around us, despite the fact that her father was still ranting and the relatives were still gasping and Jamie was still looking like he wanted to disappear into his designer suit, I caught a glimpse of that real laugh trying to escape. She was fighting it, though, fighting it hard. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and she kept pressing her lips together like she was physically trying to hold back her reaction. It was like watching someone try not to sneeze in a quiet library. Technically possible, but requiring an enormous amount of self-control and ultimately probably not worth the effort. "You can't just," she started, then stopped, probably because she couldn't figure out how to finish that sentence. "Can't just what? Can't just defend your wife when someone insults her? Can't just call out inappropriate behavior when you see it? Can't just refuse to sit quietly while your father-in-law treats your marriage like a disappointing business investment?" The internal war playing out on Claire's face was fascinating to watch. 30 years of conditioning were telling her to be mortified, to apologize to everyone, to somehow smooth this over and pretend it never happened. But there was another part of her, the part that had been suppressed for decades, that was absolutely thrilled that someone had finally stood up to Harold's tyrannical bullshit. Meanwhile, the chaos around us was reaching epic proportions. Harold was still sputtering about appropriateness and respect, apparently oblivious to the irony of demanding respect while publicly disrespecting his daughter's marriage. Gloria was frantically trying to calm him down while simultaneously apologizing to everyone within a 5-mile radius. The relatives had divided into two camps, those who were clutching their pearls and muttering about proper behavior, and those who were clearly enjoying the show more than they wanted to admit. Aunt Mildred, bless her heart, had given up all pretense of being scandalized and was openly grinning. "This is better than Netflix," she whispered to her husband, who was nodding in agreement while trying to look disapproving for appearance's sake. Even some of Harold's business buddies seemed to be having trouble maintaining their poker faces. I caught at least 2 of them exchanging amused glances when they thought no one was looking. But it was Claire's reaction that mattered most to me, because this wasn't just about putting Harold in his place, though that was certainly satisfying. This was about Claire finally seeing that she didn't have to accept her father's casual cruelty as normal family behavior. She didn't have to smile politely while he compared her to other people. She didn't have to pretend that his suggestions about other men were harmless observations. "Admit it," I said quietly, watching her face carefully. "Your dad had it coming." And that's when her carefully constructed composure finally cracked. Not in a bad way, in the best possible way. The laugh she'd been fighting finally broke free, starting as a tiny giggle that she tried to cover with her hand, then growing into something bigger and more genuine. Her eyes were watering, whether from trying not to laugh or from laughing too hard. I couldn't tell. "Oh my God," she whispered, still fighting between horror and amusement. "I can't believe you actually said that about the intern." But she was smiling as she said it, really smiling. And for the first time all evening, she looked genuinely happy instead of diplomatically pleasant. That's when I knew I'd won more than just a battle with Harold. I'd helped Claire rediscover something she'd lost years ago, the knowledge that she deserved better than his constant disapproval and manipulation. There comes a moment in every epic disaster when you realize the building is coming down and it's time to make your exit. Not a panicked scramble for the door, mind you, but a dignified, heads held high kind of departure that says, "I accomplished what I came here to do, and now I'm going to leave while I'm still winning." That moment had officially arrived at Harold's anniversary party from hell. The dining room looked like a battlefield after the smoke had cleared. Harold was still standing at the head of the table, his face cycling through colors that didn't exist in nature, making sounds that weren't quite words, but weren't quite animal noises either. Gloria had given up all pretense of maintaining her pageant queen composure and was openly wringing her hands like Lady Macbeth after a particularly rough night. The expensive tablecloth looked like a crime scene, decorated with wine stains and scattered bits of what used to be Harold's dignity. Jamie, poor, beautiful, perfectly groomed Jamie, had achieved a level of uncomfortable that probably required medical intervention. The guy was pressed so far back in his chair that I was genuinely worried he might tip over backwards and create an even bigger scene. His perfect hair was still perfect, because apparently even psychological trauma couldn't mess with whatever industrial-strength gel he used, but everything else about him screamed, "I should have stayed home and watched Netflix." The relatives were still frozen in various states of shock and amusement, like actors who'd forgotten their lines in the middle of a play. Uncle Bill was halfway between sitting and standing, apparently having gotten stuck mid-motion when his brain failed to process what was happening. Cousin Linda had her phone out and was either texting frantically or possibly posting the whole thing on social media. Knowing Linda, it was probably both. But here's the thing about reaching the point where you've burned all the bridges. It's actually incredibly liberating. I wasn't worried about Harold's opinion anymore, wasn't concerned about maintaining family harmony, wasn't trying to be the bigger person or take the high road or any of that bullshit that people tell you to do when dealing with toxic family members. I was free, and freedom felt fantastic. I stood up slowly, savoring the moment. Every eye in the room turned to me like I was about to deliver the State of the Union address. The silence was so complete that I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away, probably counting down the seconds until someone called the cops or a therapist or possibly both. "Well," I said, my voice carrying perfectly in the stunned quiet, "this has been absolutely delightful." I reached for Claire's hand, and she took it without hesitation, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture of solidarity that felt better than winning the lottery. "Thanks for inviting us to your lovely anniversary celebration, Harold. Really top-notch entertainment tonight." Harold's mouth was still opening and closing like a fish that had been yanked out of water, but no actual words were coming out. It was like watching a computer trying to run a program that was too advanced for its operating system. Lots of whirring and clicking, but no actual results. Gloria finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than actual speech. "Wait, you can't just," she started, but I held up my free hand in the universal gesture for, "Please stop talking before you make this worse for everyone." "Oh, we absolutely can," I said, helping Claire to her feet with the kind of gallant gesture that probably belonged in a romantic movie. Except this was more like a romantic comedy written by someone with serious anger management issues. In fact, leaving seems like exactly the right thing to do at this point, don't you think? The beauty of the moment was that nobody could argue with that logic. What were they going to say? "No. Please stay so Harold can continue having his breakdown, and we can all pretend this is normal family behavior." Even Gloria, master of social pleasantries and pretending everything was fine, couldn't come up with a reason why we should stick around for the encore performance. I looked around the table one more time, taking in the faces of everyone who had just witnessed Harold's spectacular meltdown. Half of them looked like they'd just watched a car crash, and the other half looked like they'd just watched the best movie of the year. Aunt Mildred actually gave me a little thumbs up, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. Next time, I said, addressing the room in general but looking directly at Harold, maybe just hire a DJ. Less drama, better music, and nobody has to worry about inappropriate dinner conversation. I paused for effect, then added with a grin. Although I have to admit, tonight's entertainment value was off the charts. That's when Harold finally managed to produce actual words instead of just angry sputtering sounds. "Get out," he roared, pointing toward the door like he was banishing us from the kingdom. "Get out of my house." "Way ahead of you, Harold," I replied cheerfully. We were already leaving. But thanks for the official send-off. Really adds to the whole experience. As we walked toward the exit, I could hear the dining room erupting behind us. Some people were gasping, others were whispering frantically, and I'm pretty sure I heard at least 3 different conversations starting with the phrase, "I can't believe he just said that." Uncle Bill's voice carried over the chaos with a loud, "Well, somebody had to say it," followed by his wife shushing him aggressively. Jamie had apparently found his voice again, because I could hear him trying to make some kind of diplomatic comment about family dynamics and understanding different perspectives. Poor guy was probably trying to salvage some kind of business relationship out of this disaster, not realizing that he'd just become a footnote in the legend of the night. Someone finally told Harold exactly what everyone had been thinking for years. Claire was walking beside me, and I could feel her shaking slightly. For a second, I worried that maybe I'd gone too far, that maybe she was upset or embarrassed or angry. But when I looked at her face, I realized she was shaking because she was trying not to laugh. Full on, tears streaming down her face. Can't catch her breath laughter was building up inside her like pressure in a steam engine. As we reached the front door, I looked back one more time at the chaos we were leaving behind. "I'll leave a Yelp review," I called back to the dining room, loud enough for everyone to hear. 5 stars for entertainment, -2 for hospitality. Overall rating, pretty damn satisfying. And with that, we walked out into the night air, leaving Harold's anniversary party in our dust like the final scene of an action movie where the heroes walk away from an explosion without looking back. You know that feeling you get after you've just survived something that should have been traumatic but ended up being surprisingly therapeutic? Like when you finally tell your boss exactly what you think of their micromanaging style, or when you hang up on a telemarketer mid-pitch. That's exactly how I felt as Claire and I walked to our car, leaving behind the smoking wreckage of what had once been a civilized anniversary dinner. The night air felt incredible against my face, cool and clean, and completely free of Harold's disapproving presence. For the first time in hours, hell, for the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like someone was judging the way my lungs expanded. It was like stepping out of a sauna into an air-conditioned room, except the sauna had been filled with passive-aggressive family members and overpriced wine. Claire was walking beside me, and I could tell she was processing everything that had just happened. Her hand was still in mine, which I took as a good sign, since usually when I've just publicly humiliated her father, she needs some space to figure out whether she wants to high-five me or strangle me. But tonight felt different. Tonight, her grip on my hand felt less like, "Don't you dare let go," and more like, "We're in this together." "I can't believe you just did that," she said as we reached the car, but her voice didn't have the edge of horror I'd been expecting. If anything, she sounded impressed, like someone who'd just watched a magic trick and couldn't figure out how it was done. "Which part?" I asked, unlocking the car doors with probably more satisfaction than a simple electronic beep deserved. "The part where I pointed out that you're married to me, or the part where I asked your dad about his intern?" Claire shook her head, but she was smiling, really smiling, not that diplomatic family gathering smile she'd perfected over the years. "All of it. The whole thing. You actually said what everyone was thinking." "Someone had to," I replied, starting the engine and pulling out of Harold's perfectly manicured driveway for what I hoped would be the last time in the foreseeable future. "The man was literally trying to auction you off to Jamie like you were some kind of prize heifer at the county fair." That's when Claire lost it. The laughter she'd been holding back all evening finally broke free, starting as a giggle and building into something that made her double over in her seat. She was laughing so hard that tears were streaming down her face, and every time she tried to stop, she'd look at me and start all over again. "Prize heifer," she gasped between fits of laughter. "Oh my God, that's exactly what it felt like. Look at this fine specimen, Jamie. Excellent breeding stock, great childbearing hips, comes with a dowry and everything. Don't forget previous owner willing to throw in cooking lessons and a 5-year warranty, I added, which sent her into another wave of hysterical laughter. But here's the thing about shared laughter after a traumatic family event. It's not just funny, it's healing. Every giggle was washing away years of Harold's subtle put-downs and not-so-subtle comparisons. Every tear Claire cried from laughing too hard was erasing a little bit of the damage her father had done to her self-worth over the decades. Your face when you asked about the intern, she managed to say through her tears, was absolutely priceless. You looked so innocent, like you were genuinely curious about Harold's mentorship techniques. I was genuinely curious. I protested with fake indignation. I mean, if the man's going to play matchmaker for everyone else, it seems only fair that someone returns the favor, right? By the time we pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, a gloriously greasy 24-hour burger joint that was the complete opposite of Harold's pretentious anniversary venue, Claire had laughed herself into a state of exhausted contentment. Her makeup was smeared, her hair was mussed, and she looked absolutely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with trying to impress anyone. I'm starving, she announced as we walked toward the diner's neon-lit entrance. I was so nervous about tonight that I barely ate anything at dinner. Good thing, I said, holding the door open for her, because nobody actually ate at that party anyway. Too much drama, not enough actual food consumption. Murphy's Diner was exactly what we needed after Harold's formal dining room nightmare. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, a jukebox in the corner playing classic rock, and a waitress named Dolores who called everyone honey and didn't give a damn about proper etiquette. It was like entering an alternate universe where people were allowed to be themselves without worrying about what anyone else thought. We slid into a booth near the window, and for the first time all evening, I felt completely relaxed. No fancy place settings to navigate, no business associates to impress, no Harold glaring at me from across the table and mentally calculating my net worth. Just me, my wife, and the promise of a burger that wouldn't judge me for putting ketchup on it. So, Claire said, stealing one of my fries even though she'd ordered her own. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much trouble are we in with my family? I pretended to think about it seriously while taking a massive bite of my bacon cheeseburger. Well, let's see. I publicly called out your father's inappropriate behavior, made jokes about his relationship with a 20-year-old intern, and basically told the entire family that he's a hypocritical ass who's been treating you like property for years. I paused for another bite. So probably about an 11. Good, Claire said, and the conviction in her voice surprised both of us. Maybe now he'll think twice before trying to trade me in for a newer model at his next dinner party. That's when I knew we'd crossed some kind of threshold. This wasn't just about me defending Claire or putting Harold in his place. This was about Claire finally recognizing that she deserved better than her father's constant disapproval and manipulation. She deserved to be treated like a person instead of a disappointment, like a daughter instead of a business liability. For what it's worth, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. I thought tonight went pretty well. Claire nearly choked on her milkshake. Pretty well? You just declared war on my entire family. Your family declared war on our marriage first, I pointed out. I just fired back with better ammunition. And maybe, just maybe, Harold would finally understand that his married daughter wasn't available for redistribution, no matter how much he preferred Jamie's portfolio to mine.